Okay, good morning, people. Welcome to Tuesday, um, week 11, is it? Yeah, week 11. Um, it's a beautiful day out there in Vancouver if you're here. It's going to be really hot. Um, so if you can, get out later today because it'll be good for your skin and your health to get a little fresh air and sunshine. But stay away from people because there's still coronavirus cases. Um, yeah, let's see who's here. So Duong's here. Good morning, Duong. Sorry, it's an awkward start for me this morning. I don't know why. Karen's here. Good morning, Karen. Good morning, Monica. Benamir's here. Good morning, Benamir. Baha's here. Good morning. I'm here. Good morning, Mike. Jimmy's here. Good morning, Jimmy. Good morning, Mashid. Casey's here. Good morning, Casey. Erica's here. Hello, Erica. Good evening to you. And Jenna's here. Good morning, Jenna. Um, so, to give you a quick idea, what we'll do today is a couple things. We'll try to wrap up the sexism unit. We've kind of been doing the sexism thing for a couple weeks now, so I think it's time to move on. After this, I have a short little blurb on ableism, and so we'll do that very quickly. And then originally I wanted to do a little thing on religious oppression and a little thing on classism. And I'm not sure, we're kind of coming to the end of the term here, and I'm not sure how much I can really squeeze in. So whether we deal with those topics, I'm not entirely sure that we will. One of the things I mentioned yesterday when we were doing quizzes is that toward the end of the term, one of the nice things about having a social studies or a history class is that you kind of don't have to finish everything. Sometimes in a science or a math class, there's a bunch of skills that you have to learn in order to go to the next level. And in this case, there's always stuff that we could deal with, but we don't have to. And so if we don't get to classism or if we don't deal with religious oppression, it's not the end of the world. We can kind of end it where we want. And so there's that. And the other thing is I try to, when we get to the end of the term, I feel that there's a lot of stuff going on which you probably are aware of. There's lots of exams coming up and assignments coming due and all kinds of things, and you're getting tired because you've been doing this for 11 weeks. And so I try not to cram more in toward the end. I try to sort of relax things a little bit, just because the workload gets more intense towards the end. So there's a few more topics that I would like to touch. I don't know how or if we'll get into them, but I'm not going to sort of cram everything into the last few weeks. We'll just, we'll get a chance to do what we do, and then the rest we'll save for another day, for another course kind of thing, right? So yeah, so today we'll wrap up sexism. Also, I have your final assignment that I'll give to you today. I'm still marking your second micropaper, and I'll get that back to you absolutely as soon as I can, because I know you will need some feedback from that in order to do the final paper. The final paper is a little bit different than what we've been doing so far, but I'll explain it to you. I'll explain it to you in due course, but we'll try and finish up the sexism stuff first, okay? And Tika's here too. Good morning, or good evening. Okay, let's dive in. So if you remember, way back to Friday, we were talking about women's suffrage, right? Women winning the right to vote in the last century here in the U.S. and Canada. Kind of for many women at the beginning of the century in the early 1900s, but for many other women, that right to vote came later, right? And so we said that women played an important and a primary and a critical role in gaining the right to vote, right? Women were the ones who had to stand up and speak up and say, this is unequal, this isn't right, we deserve the right to vote and participate in the political world as well. They had to demonstrate, they had to hold talks, they had to write things and distribute leaflets and all kinds of things, right? They had to work very hard in order to get the message out and convince the rest of society that women should have the right to vote. But of course, men held institutional control at the time, right? They held political and social and institutional control. And so women kind of needed men to agree with them, unfortunately, because men were the ones who held the power. Women couldn't grant themselves the right to vote. They had to ask men for it, because again, men were the ones who had the power. We said that because men were and still are the dominant group in society, they are able to reinforce their prejudices throughout society, right? So the way that men think the world works and the way that they think the world should work, that gets reflected in how society is constructed, right? And so in the past, and to some degree in the present, men have created a world that advantages themselves and disadvantages women in a number of different ways. And again, it's important to point out, and this is an element of privilege, right? This is an element of privilege, that all men benefit from women being marginalized, from women being in the minoritized group. I benefit from it, right? And again, it doesn't matter whether I believe that women should or shouldn't have equality, or whether they should or shouldn't be allowed to vote, which of course they should be allowed to vote and they should have equality. But it doesn't matter what I think, because again, these sort of larger inequalities are baked into the way society works. And so I benefit from the fact that women are disadvantaged. And again, I don't have to agree with it, and I don't, but I still benefit anyway, right? So again, remember that oppression is not personal, and it's not about really intention as well. It has to do with having privilege and having advantage and the way that society actually operates. Yeah, the other thing I'll point out here in speaking about women and suffrage and the political world is that we said, good morning, Chan. We said that being in the dominant group or being in the minoritized group isn't about numbers either, right? So women are the majority in the US and Canada. So if you're in Canada here, ladies, there's 52% of you and only 48% of us guys. But men continue to hold institutional power, and men are still the dominant group. And so being in the dominant group isn't about numbers. It's not about majority and minority. It's about who is in power. In the case of women's suffrage, again, there's something else more complicated going on, and I think you just read about that, and we'll try to unpack it a little bit if we can. But in the case of women's suffrage, there are intersecting identities, right? There are other social groups that these women belong to that affect how this right to vote was actually won. And so, again, in Canada and the US, the right to vote, or the campaign for the right to vote, was led by white women. And for a long time, only white women were arguing that, or white women were arguing that only white women should be allowed to vote. And so when women were granted the right to vote in the early 1900s in the US and Canada, that didn't actually extend to all women. Women of color, Indigenous women, were not included in that provision. And so you'll see in Canada here, there were racial exclusions for women's suffrage all the way into the 1940s. And so black women, for instance, in Canada cannot vote until the 1940s, even though white women were allowed to vote in the 1920s. And Indigenous women and Indigenous people, they weren't allowed to vote until the 1960s. So again, this winning the right to vote for women, when it happens in the early 1900s, it only happens for some women. It doesn't happen for all, right? And here you can see in the US, black women don't have full access to vote until 1965, right? So again, this these women's intersecting identities, right? Not just their gender, but their race, also affects their right to vote, right? It also affects their outcomes. So in a way, and this is important to remember too, the suffragists were privileged in one way because they were white women. They were marginalized as being women because women are the minoritized group, but as white people, they're in the dominant group. And so they had more privilege, they had more social power than, say, women of color or indigenous women at the time. But often when we tell this story, we tell the story of women gaining the right to vote in, the early 1900s and the suffragettes, and we sort of tell this story, but we forget the fact that many, many women did not have the right to vote until much, much later. And so we kind of hold up white women as representing all women, but that wasn't the case. Okay, so I showed you some of these stats the other day, and I said that, even though women gained the right to vote in the early 1900s, and of course, women of color and indigenous women gained the right to vote much later, we still see a pretty marked disparity in the representation of women in the political world, right? And so, again, if you're in the US, if you look at Congress or the House of Representatives, that's where Nancy Pelosi works, if you're following US news at all. If you look at the Senate, that's where Mitch McConnell works, if you're following the US news at all. Really only 19% of those representatives, congresspeople, and senators, only 19% of them are women. As it turns out, 33% of Supreme Court judges are women, which is pretty good, and it's a higher percentage because it's a smaller group. I think there's only 9 Supreme Court seats, and so it's easier to have a higher percentage. But in the House and the Senate, only 20%. U.S. mayors, only 18%. U.S. governors, only 8%. And of course, we've never had a female president. And again, in Canada, we're not really doing that much better. Again, 52% of the population are women, so they're in the majority technically, but only 26% of MPs, those are members of parliament, those are the people that Canadians elect and send to Ottawa to run the federal government. Only 26% of those are women. And we see some similar patterns with city councillors and mayors in Canada as well. And so even though a majority of people in Canada are female, they're not really represented in the political world, right? They're markedly underrepresented. And again, this is important because the UN feels that you need at least 30% of the government to be composed of women in order for them to have a meaningful voice, in order for them to have enough power and to sort of speak loudly enough for the rest of the government to hear them. But of course, we see that in the US and Canada, that's not the case. We don't have more than 30%. And so the UN would argue that women actually don't have a meaningful voice in government in both the US and in Canada, which to most Canadians would probably surprise them because we like to think that some of us like to think that we are gender equal, which is not true. Some of us like to think we're really, really close, which, well, we can talk about that a little bit later. But in fact, we are not doing very well in this regard, right? Our government is overwhelmingly made up of men, and we come in a lot lower on the list of female representation than some other countries that probably Canadians would be surprised to hear about, right? So I'm sure many Canadians would be surprised to hear that Rwanda is overwhelmingly female in terms of their government representation. And the other top 10 countries like Sweden and Spain and Argentina and countries there, some of those countries Canadians would be surprised to hear are on the list above them as well. Okay, so I asked you to read this article, and it's a little bit of a tricky article. Okay, it's a little bit tricky to read. It's not it wasn't an easy one, but I think it's okay. It was short, and it's short enough that we can discuss and unpack whatever we need to unpack. So that was the first question I asked you. The article has three major things that make sexism difficult to see. What were those things? Okay, so Casey's got some stuff here. So what does Casey says? She says dominant culture focuses on people's patterns, which makes it harder to see. Okay, I'm gonna qualify that, but I think you're in the right area. Popular culture is more pervasive through social media, advertising, and schools, and sexism is seen as being civilized and liberated. Not quite, but you're close. You're close. There's a couple things going on here. Okay, Karen's got one too. So Karen says it is portrayed as an issue for developing countries and not for the U.S. or Canada. Yeah. So that's part of the third. That's part of the third piece. So we have some sort of involvement of the Western world and sort of the non-Western world, right? I don't want to use the developed and the developing world. I don't want to use that, but some people use that terminology, right? The developed versus the developing world. In the past, people would say like the first world and the third world, but I don't think anyone really says that anymore. But kind of East and West, right? Westernized and non-Westernized countries. There's a comparison going on there. Okay, what else? Oh, sorry. No. What else? Do we have anything else for that one? I know this is a tricky one. Let's start on the first one here. So KC says, I'm going to go back to KC for a sec. Dominant culture focuses on patterns that make it harder for people to see. So that's true. And what the article is talking about, I'm just going to turn the fan on because it's really hot in here. Okay. Whew. Okay, that's better. Hopefully the fan won't be too loud. Let me know if it is, okay? Yeah, so dominant culture focuses on people's patterns which make it harder to see. And Karen clarifies for us, is the fan okay here, by the way? Is it too noisy? I don't think it is, but I can't tell. Yeah, so people think it's only a few people who are evil. So that is true. So let's go here. Yeah, so this is one of the things that we often see, okay? So when we're talking about sexism, you don't hear it. Okay, good. Thanks, Baha. One of the things we often see is that when we're looking at sexism, and particularly what we're talking about here is kind of systemic sexism. So the sexism that is kind of part of culture that's hard to see. It becomes more difficult to see when we see really extreme instances of sexism. So here, I just pulled this out of the off the BBC, but of course it's sadly it's very easy to find stories like this, where this young woman from the UK was raped and murdered on her way home from a friend's house, or from on her way home by a friend. I'm not sure what's going on there. So these sort of very clear stories, news stories of violence against women, are awful. Good morning, Justin. These stories are awful, but they often distract us from the sort of general environment of sexism throughout society, right? Because we see this thing right here, we see, gosh, it's awful, it's horrible, which it is, but that's not the extent of sexism in Western countries, right? This is not the only manifestation of it, right? And so if we pay too much attention to individual instances, particularly the ones that are kind of very dramatic and very, very awful, honor killings would fit into this category. When we focus on those, it makes it harder to see this sort of more subtle, less visible sexism that surrounds us in society. And so, again, these sort of major incidents that you see in the news are awful, and we should feel sorry for the victims, and we should be very upset with the perpetrators. But that's not the end of sexism, right? That's not where sexism begins and ends. There's more outside. It's just harder to see, and this stuff is very easy to see. Let's talk about the second one here. So popular culture becomes pervasive in our lives through social media. That is very true. So the article here is talking about corporate culture and how products are sold to us, right? So we talked about that a little bit already, right? We said that toys and many other products for adults as well, but for kids, many toys are heavily gendered, right? And we said that these toys have social messages attached to them in terms of strength and power and violence, and maybe how to solve problems, right? And maybe what your future occupation should be. Whereas toys for girls are very different, right? And they portray social messages of being passive, being domestic, looking after babies and looking pretty. That's the messages that are passed on. And so the article is saying here that as corporate culture gets bigger and bigger and more powerful, and as you see bigger and bigger companies appearing, which we do, the version of masculinity and femininity, those ideas get really, really narrow, right? Because they have to, if you're making a toy, you're not just making a toy for a small group of people, you're going to manufacture millions and millions and millions of this toy. And so you want it to appeal to everyone, and so you kind of narrowly focus what messages that send, right? So sort of the diversity of human experience gets reduced, if that makes any sense, okay? It's the Walmartization of sexuality, if you will. I don't know if that makes any sense. The third one that Casey has and that Karen has here is sexism is seen as being civilized and liberated. And so there's something about portraying sexism as an issue for developing countries or for non-Western countries, not for Canada or the US, okay? And so what's kind of happening here, what the article is saying is that, I was going to add that in terms of sexist advertising, right? So we have pretty clear ideas of what men are supposed to be like here. Out rock climbing, hanging from a rock, drinking milk. Apparently that's what men are supposed to do. Probably the less said about the one on the right, the better. I'll just leave that for you. And then messages sent to women, right? What are women supposed to be, right? this one was actually, I just found this one, but this one was actually very recent, very recently in the news. And Bic, of course, the company that makes pens, retracted this ad and apologized for it because it's super sexist, right? Look like a girl, act like a lady, think like a man, work like a boss, right? So what's this ad saying? It's saying that if you want to succeed in business, don't think like a woman, that's no good. Think like a man, because that's how you'll succeed. Whew. Super sexist, right? And of course they hashtag Happy Women's Day. So yeah, nice try, Bic. Sorry, I forgot I had that in there. Okay, the third one was this, right, where Karen says that sexism is portrayed as an issue for developing countries and not for the US. So this can happen as well, that people here in the West can look at countries that are can look at countries where there's greater inequality between men or women, or that inequality between men and women is sort of expressed in more obvious ways, or even in just different ways than we see here in Canada and the US. And so what that allows kind of Western societies to do is look at, a picture like this, for instance. Western people can look at a picture like this and they can say, oh, well, that's sexism over there, right? Over in those countries, quote unquote, those countries, that's where they have sexism. But here we don't have that, right? Because women can walk around and wear whatever they want. So we must not have sexism, and they over there, they do, right? So Western people can kind of convince themselves that sexism isn't a problem in their own country, because they see other places and they imagine, oh, that's what sexism is over there, right? But we don't have that, right? So that's kind of what the article is saying, is that it's sexism is hidden by, I'm just going to go back here. Sexism is hidden by three things. Yeah, sexism is hidden by three things. Whoops, I went the wrong way. Sorry, guys. Oh. Okay, I guess I didn't have a slide for that. So sexism is hidden in three ways. Number one, it's hidden by focusing too heavily on individual actions. And so, when you see these horrible stories in the news of violence against women, it's very easy to think, oh, well, it's just a few people, right? Obviously, there's a few misogynists out there. There's a few really awful people, but otherwise we live in a equal society. And it's true, there may be some awful people out there, but we don't live in an equal society. There is still sexism. There is still inequality within society. But focusing on these extreme examples helps to sort of hide that, those more subtle patterns, right? The idea that popular culture reinforces our ideas of what men and women should be. And over time, I think those ideas are becoming narrower and narrower, right? Because it's easier to sell things when they're simple, right? It's easier to sell things when you appeal to people's stereotypes. And we talked about that already, right? Because if you give people something that they stereotypically understand, they understand it very quickly, and then they can focus on the product you're selling. If you give them something that's very novel and very strange, people are going to pay attention to trying to figure that out, and they're not going to pay attention to the product you're trying to sell. So often advertising, often the products we buy, and sometimes even the movies that we watch are very stereotypical because they don't distract from the product, and also because they work, right? When we talked about romantic comedies, a lot of those romantic comedies have a very similar plot line. Is that an accident? No, it's not an accident, because people like that plot line. People keep going to see that movie, even though there's a different actress and she has a slightly different job, and the Prince Charming kind of guy is a different actor, and the jokes are new, and the fashion's different. There's all these kind of superficial differences, but the plot is the same, right? And why is the plot the same? Because people seem to like it, and people pay money to watch the film. Right? And finally, there's this comparison of the East and the West, right? And so here in the West, how we have been socialized is we've been socialized to think of ourselves as free, right? As equal, right? As an open society with lots of freedom, right? That's what we've been socialized to believe. And to some degree, that is true. There is truth to that. But that doesn't mean that there is no sexism in a country like Canada or in the US. But it's very easy for people in Western countries to look at other countries and imagine, oh, well, that's what sexism looks like over there. We don't have that, right? We don't have that version of sexism. And so yeah, we must be civilized and liberated, where over there they are not. Now, what's going on over there is kind of another story, right? We could dig into that. But for our purposes here, basically we're saying, how does the West see non-Western countries? How do they perceive them? And how do they use what they perceive to hide the sexism in their own country? That's what we're saying. It's tricky, I know. Okay, the second question I asked you, I think I probably answered this question already, because sometimes I do that, which you probably know by now. But what did you say for this one? Ideology of the civilized world versus the uncivilized world, and we should definitely have some quotes around those civilized and uncivilized, because those can be kind of problematic words. They're sort of colonial in basis, and so they're not really perfect words. But let's see what we have here. So Casey has they call civilized people West and uncivilized in the East. This way, West people look at the East, they see the opposite of themselves. Yeah, that's very true, right? So, is it any more complicated than that? It probably isn't. It probably isn't any more complicated than that, right? The idea that, yeah, basically anyone who's not from Europe or North America is, they're in a non-Western country, right? And so depending on how people see other parts of the world, they might use other terms, right? And so, I'm trying to use terms that are sort of not disrespectful, right? So kind of Western and maybe non-Western. But other people might say civilized and uncivilized. And again, those are problematic terms, right? Developed and developing, yeah, they're kind of okay maybe, but yeah, people are looking to other countries and seeing them as less, right? Seeing them as not as developed, not as civilized, places where there's greater oppression. Yeah, and really, and again, the statement here, and I'll grab your comment in a second there, Baha. The statement here, women wearing hijabs is oppressed, that's a controversial statement as well. And so we might have time to get into that. We might have time to get into that. For now, I might leave it alone, because there are different elements to that conversation, but that statement is part of the civilized uncivilized thing for sure, Karen. And Boss says now countries with power are civilized, and really that's probably the better way to think about it. Is that Western countries are the ones with economic and military power for the most part, and so we're not really talking about countries with we're not really talking about countries that are civilized or cultured or developed or anything like that. We're more talking about an ideological difference, and in some ways a power difference as well, although we are seeing non-Western countries kind of step into that sphere of power as well. And I'm thinking of China for sure, and to some degree Russia, depending on what happens with them in the next little while. Yeah, okay. Okay, that's good. Okay, so we've been working hard for a little bit. Let's take a little break. Come back in 10, and we'll wrap up this sexism thing. Okay, so take a break. I'll see you back here 10 minutes. Okay, people, and we're back. So, I'm going to talk a little bit about gender equality now. Blah, blah, blah. I'm going to talk about gender equality now and kind of what it means and what it looks like and what it doesn't look like. And then I'll stop it. We'll talk about the final research paper, and then tomorrow we'll just do a summary of sexism, okay? Because it looks like that's how the time is going to work out, okay? So we just finished that short little section of a chapter, actually, from a book, and it talked about why sexism is difficult to see. And we said, again, that sometimes we focus on big sensational events in the news, like particular incidences of violence against women, and sometimes we kind of think that that is sexism, and so it kind of blinds us to the sexism that's around us, right? We said similarly that corporate culture, in terms of ads and products and movies and TV, sometimes narrow the function of what masculinity and femininity is. And so corporate culture isn't trying to expose sexism, they're trying to use sexism to sell their products, which they kind of do. And the third one was that often we look at other countries, particularly in a globalized world where we have access to news from all around the world. Sometimes we look at other countries and it's very easy for Western countries to imagine themselves as, I was going to say superior, but maybe that's not right, but imagine themselves as kind of doing better in the area of sexism than other countries are. And again, you know, you could probably make an argument like that for some countries, but the issue here is not whether we are less sexist or more sexist than this country or that country. What's being said here is that because we imagine other countries to be more sexist or to have real problems with sexism, it allows us not to see the sexism within our own country. That's what we're saying here. Whether or not we're more or less sexist, that's another argument. Right, so what makes sexism difficult to see? Well, those three things, but let me show you how we do see it, okay? So we do see it in looking at gender equality, okay? And of course, what we want, well, we want this for all social groups, but for gender equality, what we're looking for is for all genders to have equal rights and responsibilities and opportunities, right? And so, again, this doesn't mean that everyone should be the same, right? It doesn't mean that everyone gets treated the same. And this is an important concept. So when you're thinking about equality, it doesn't mean that everyone gets the same thing, okay? So imagine that we're all in class, okay? So back before anyone had heard of COVID, we're all in class and we're gonna write a test, okay? Imagine that. So we're all sitting in the room ready to write a test. And I say, well, we have to be equal, right? We have to make sure that this is equitable here. So nobody can wear glasses, right? Because those of you who wear glasses, you'll have an advantage over other people. So nobody can wear glasses to write the test. Now, for lots of people, that won't make a difference, right? For people like me, whatever, I can write it without glasses, no problem. But there are some people who need glasses to read the test, right? And they won't be able to succeed in the test because they physically cannot read the words in front of them, right? So what if I say, oh, okay, well, that's not fair. So everyone has to wear glasses, right? Everyone wears glasses and that way things will be equal. But again, some people will be able to do the test very well because they've got glasses on and they need glasses. But then other people will be wearing glasses and they won't be able to read properly and it'll hurt their eyes and give them headaches and it'll be more difficult for them to succeed on the test, right? So how do we create equality there? Well, we give people the support they need in order to have an equal opportunity to pass the test, right? So if you need glasses, you should wear them, right? If you don't need glasses, then don't wear them. But either way, even though we're treating people differently, people have the same opportunity to succeed on the exam, right? And so if you need support, if you need visual support, then use it. If you don't need it, then don't use it. And that way everyone has an equal opportunity to score well on the exam, right? So here we're looking at equal rights and responsibilities and opportunities for all genders. But again, it doesn't mean necessarily that everyone gets treated the same. It doesn't mean that everyone gets exactly the same thing. But it does mean that your rights and responsibilities and opportunities shouldn't be tied to your gender, right? And again, this is an issue that affects everybody, right? It's not just a women's issue. It's not just a transgender issue. It's everyone's issue, right? Equality, and we'll get to this a little bit later, but equality makes life better for everybody, even people in the dominant group. So in Canada, how are we doing? How are we doing with gender equality? Well, okay, but not super great. If you look, I'm going to sneeze here in a second. Okay, I'm back. Whew. Okay. If you look in terms of the official listing of global gender gap rankings, you'll find us at 30th place, right? And that's pretty shocking, I think, for a country that prides itself on freedom and equality and taking care of its citizens and things like that. Finding us that far down the gender gap list is pretty shocking. I don't think that's something for Canada to be proud of. I think that's something that Canada needs to look at, because again, I think if you asked most Canadians, they would definitely say that we are in the top 10, and quite a few Canadians would probably even say that we are in the top 5. But of course, we're not anywhere close to that, right? We're number 35, and we've gone down, right? We've fallen down the list. So how can we see some of the effects of this inequality? Well, we can see it in a few ways. In gender-based violence, we can see it in statistics around sexual assault and harassment. We can see it around the wage gap between men and women. That last one should be barriers that girls face. It shouldn't just say girls face. Little typo there. I'll fix that. So, gender-based violence. The unfortunate situation here in Canada, and of course this is certainly true of the US and probably true of many other countries, that Canadian women and girls live in an environment of a heightened risk of violence. And usually that violence comes at the hands of someone that they know. And so unfortunately, we are taught to, even as children, we're taught to beware of strangers and, be fearful of people we don't know. But in many, many cases, and probably most cases, violence is perpetrated against women by people they know, either their parents or their romantic or domestic partner. And we see this violence taking a lot of different forms. And so sometimes it can be sexual assault, sometimes it can be cyber violence, sometimes it can be emotional manipulation or emotional abuse. There's all kinds of ways in which this kind of violence can be manifested. If you look at the stats, you will see, unfortunately, that think about this, half of all women in Canada have experienced at least one incident of physical or sexual violence since the age of 16. That is a shocking statistic. Half, right? 50% have experienced at least one incident of physical or sexual violence. 67% of Canadians say they know someone personally, or they personally know at least one woman who has experienced physical or sexual abuse. That is shocking, right? That's over 2/3 know someone. And keep in mind that often physical or sexual abuse is not something that's reported, right? It's not something that women go around talking about all the time. And so the fact that 67% of Canadians actually know someone, and they know something that people often don't report, basically means that 100% of people know someone. All Canadians know someone who has experienced sexual or physical violence. It's just that they may not actually know about it, right? Because people often don't want to talk about this, right? Approximately every 6 days, a woman in Canada is killed by her intimate partner. Of intimate partner homicides, so boyfriend and girlfriend, husband and wife scenarios, where one partner kills the other one, 80% of the victims are women, right? Women are killed by their husbands pretty frequently, much more frequently than women kill their husbands, right? Sorry, did I say that already? Okay. Anyway, you can read it. And again, on any given night in Canada, there's 3,500 women and 2,700 children sleeping in shelters because they can't go home, because it's not safe, right? And it's not safe because of their male partner, right? Let's look at sexual assault and harassment. We were talking about that with Harrison Ford movies, right? We were talking about predatory romance and how Harrison Ford's characters don't respect women's voice and women's anger, and they kind of take what they want. And so here we have, kind of the real world example of that. In 2014 alone, 500,000 sexual assaults were reported in this social survey on victimization. And keep in mind, that doesn't cover everybody, right? Lots of people who are sexually assaulted or sexually harassed, they don't report these things, right? They just want to forget about it. They want it to go away. They fear that the person who committed the sexual assault or harassment will come after them and hurt them if they tell anyone. They're ashamed to tell anyone. And so basically you can look at all these numbers and they're all low. They're all low because many of these things don't actually get reported. And so if we have 500,000 sexual assaults in 2014, we have more than that. We have way more. It's just that many people don't report them. Women were 10 times more likely than men to be victims of sexual assault in 2008. And again, although men and women both experience sexual assault, women are the victims 92% of the time, right? So sexual assault, sexual harassment, those are things that overwhelmingly happen to women. Even though women are only 50% of the population, it happens to them 70, 80, 90% of the time. Sexual assault in Canada is the only violent crime that is not declining, right? So many people, particularly, politicians like Trump, would have you believe that, we live in a dangerous society. But if you look at the crime rates, you'll see that, robbery of people and of businesses, physical assaults, even murders are declining, right? They're becoming less common in society, but sexual assault is not, right? Sexual assault is remaining consistent. And actually in the years you see there, in 2009 to 2013, sexual assaults against women by their partners actually increased. So these things aren't going away. These things aren't getting better. They're staying the same, or in some cases they're either getting worse or they're getting reported more often. And in many cases, these are younger people who sexual assault and harassment happens to. And so if you look at Canadians and Canadian women from ages 15 to 24, their rate of sexual assault is 18 times higher. And again, 82% of the victims of sexual assault under 18 are female, right? So this is a problem that affects both genders. It affects boys and girls, but far more likely to affect girls, right? You can see the stats there. I'm just going to jump ahead a little bit here. some of the barriers that girls face. So if you look at mental health, for instance, you'll see that girls' mental health and confidence in themselves is not high, and it declines as these girls get older. And so if you see in grade 6, 36% of girls say that they feel self-confident, that they feel confident in themselves. But by grade 10, only 14. So 85% of grade 10 girls are not feeling confident in themselves. Many young girls report feeling depressed between 9 and 13. That's really young. That's really young to be feeling depressed. And 12% of girls aged 12 to 19 say they have experienced a major depressive episode at some point in their life. More girls are hospitalized for mental disorders than boys at the same age. And again, there are probably socialization aspects to this, but it still should alarm us. Girls are far more likely to be affected by eating disorders, self-harm. Girls are far more likely to self-harm, to cut themselves. And suicide is the third highest cause of death for young girls. Even age 10 to 14, that's really, really young, right? If you look at the gender pay gap, the gender pay gap is a little controversial sometimes. There's basically 3 different ways to calculate it. So you can look at the annual earnings, so the amount of money people earn by gender for both full and part-time workers. You can compare the annual earnings of full-time workers, or you can compare the hourly pay of full-time working women to those of men. So you can compare how much money men and women make in 3 different ways. But it doesn't really matter how you compare it, women still come out on the lower end. And so if you compare annual earnings by gender for full and part-time workers, you'll see that women earn about 69 cents for every dollar earned by men. If you compare this by looking at just the annual earnings of full-time workers, you'll see that women earn about 75 cents on the dollar for every dollar earned by men. And so again, women come out below. If you compare hourly wage, you'll still see that women earn about 87 cents for every dollar earned by men. And so it doesn't matter which calculation you use, we still wind up paying women less, markedly less than we pay men for exactly the same job, for exactly the same work. Okay, so I'm going to leave it there for now, and I just want to talk quickly about the final paper that we're going to do. Okay, so let me just put it up on the screen here. Let's put it up on the screen, and then we'll walk through it. All right, so here it is. Now, this is what I'll ask you to do. So this document is already in Microsoft Teams under Files, and it's also in Student Portal under Course Documents. So what I want you to do, as you can see, is I want you to write a short paper that answers one of these following questions. Just one, not 3, just one. One question is, in what way are different kinds of social justice issues interconnected? Okay, that's one question. Or you could write your question on how do individual worldviews, yours or someone else's, shape or inform your understanding of social justice issues. Okay. And third question that you could answer, just answer one. What are the causes of a particular instance or manifestation of social inequality? How does it affect people, and how might it be remedied? Okay. Now for that last one, I just want to caution you and say, if you want to pick it, you want to pick something that's sort of a narrower topic, right? So if I'm saying a particular instance of social inequality, don't choose sexism because it's too big, right? You might want to say, the health of Indigenous women, or the gender pay gap in Canada, or sexual assault on university campuses, or something like that. Okay, so it's a much narrower topic. Just sexism or just racism, that's way too big, right? You need something a little bit more focused. Okay. And so when you talk about social justice issues and social inequalities, you can talk about any of these things here that we've already discussed, right? So you'll probably recognize this little chart from earlier, and so you can talk about any of these different types of oppression in your paper. I just kind of put it there to remind you. You can also go to a website here that I've listed. It's just one website, but it might give you some inspiration on a social justice issue that you would like to write on. Okay, so in your paper, you're going to answer one of those three questions. Okay, and so what do I want? Well, I want a paper that clearly answers a question using an argument. And so in your other papers, I haven't quite asked for that. I've asked you to summarize research and respond to it. And again, you've done a good job with that. And so you'll be doing both of those things in this paper. You'll be summarizing some other people's work, and you'll be talking about your own views as well. But you'll need to structure your paper in terms of a clear argument, and I can help you with that. I'd like you to use a minimum of 3 outside sources, so you will have to do a little bit of research and looking for material for this paper. You can use stuff we've talked about in class, you just have to cite it, okay? Again, use MLA format just like we've already done. Make sure your sources are all credible, which of course we know that we have to do. Don't plagiarize any of your materials. So again, no copying and pasting. And if you borrow other people's information or ideas, you should cite it, right? Length. So I'm going to say about 700 to 900 words. Okay, so that's about 2 or 3 pages, give or take. And so it's probably 2 to 3 times the length of what you've written for me already. Okay. In terms of formatting, I've got some formatting tips for you there. So font and 12 point and double space, please and thank you. Put a title at the top and your name and your ID number up there too. There's some links to MLA citation style, which I think I've given you before, but I'll give you again here. In terms of how I'll grade it, I've included a marking guide so that you can look at that as well. And we'll have it due on the last day of class. So you've got just a little less than 3 weeks to complete this, okay? So what I'm kind of looking for in this paper is for you to show me what you've learned, okay? So we've been talking about social justice stuff, social justice issues for 11 weeks now, for over 2 months. Show me what you know. And so how you'll do that, how you'll show me what you know, is in sort of how you answer the question, right? What kind of information you include in your paper, and how you talk about it, okay? So really what I'm looking for here is not for you to fill your paper with outside material, although you'll have to do some of that. Not to just give me opinions or give me opinions that you think I want to hear, what I want to do is I want to see you thinking. I want to see you taking this material, understanding it, and putting it together in a way that shows me that you have learned, that you have absorbed the content of this culture, of this course, that you understand what we've talked about, that you understand how social inequality works, that you understand how prejudice works and privilege and whatever else comes up in the discussion of your question, okay? So that's really what I'm trying to determine is, have you understood this course? Have you understood how these types of oppressions and privileges and prejudices and all these things, do you understand how they work, and do you understand how they fit together and operate together? Okay, so that's really what I'm looking for, is trying to figure out if you, in short, I'm trying to figure out if you get it. Okay, and so in this paper, you're going to take some information from outside, you're going to take some information from this course, you're going to answer this question, and you're going to answer it in a way that convinces me that, yes, you get this stuff. You understand what we've been doing. Okay? Now, that said, what would help you succeed? And so what I'm asking you here is that I can talk about a few things to help you along in class. So I could talk about paragraph structure, I could talk about, outlines, I could talk more about arguments and critical thinking, I could talk about citations and paraphrasing and plagiarizing. I could talk about all those things, but what would help you? What would you want me to talk about maybe tomorrow or the day after that might help you to be successful here? So I can do, short little sections that might help you in some way. So what do you think? What would be useful to you in terms of, what would be useful for you? Oh, so Baha says, give an example of a perfect paper. I was kind of hoping you would do that for me, Baha. I was hoping you would write me a perfect paper. I don't know that I have a perfect paper. I don't know that I have a perfect paper, and if I had one, I would have to have a student's permission to share it, which I don't have. So I don't have a perfect paper on me, but especially for some of these questions, because some of them are new. Some of these questions I haven't used before. So I definitely don't have one on these topics. And so, that I don't have. So, but I'm hoping that you'll maybe write me one. Of course you will. Okay. Format. What do you mean by format, or should it be the same as the previous micropaper? Well, that could be something that I could talk about in terms of sort of paper structure. I know I gave you that little colored graphic last time, and I'm not doing it this time. But I could talk a little bit about, how you might sort of structure your paper Is that what you're asking, KC? And would that be helpful? Because I could do that for sure. Is that what you mean? Okay. Yeah, that's no problem. I can talk about that tomorrow a little bit in terms of how you should structure it. Although I will say at the same time that well, maybe I won't. Maybe I'll. You can do whatever you want. Of course, it's your paper. But I will give you a bit of a recommendation of how I think you should do it. Okay, the way that your paper will make the most sense. And then when you become, famous writers, you can all, throw that format out the window and do whatever you want. But for now, I can give you a little bit of help in terms of structure and how I think a paper like this works. Yeah, I'm very happy to do that. Yeah. So Karen says you don't know. Okay, well you can think about it, Karen. That's no problem. Okay. Let's have it. What's your suggestion? You make your suggestion. I'm gonna heat up my coffee. Yeah, what's your suggestion there, Baha? Why don't we do it as a class and give you examples in our writing and you combine them all together to get a perfect paper? Couple of reasons. One, because I have to do enough work marking all these things, so I don't want to put it together for you. Two, nothing is kind of gained by that, because basically you're going to give me a bunch of stuff and then I'm going to try to combine it to make it add up to something. But that's what I want you to do. I want you to be able to sort of take what we've learned in this course and show me that it adds up to something for you, not for me. Okay, so plus trying to take a bunch of people and combine their writing is a lot of work, and it would probably just be a mess, to be honest. Yeah, so nice try, but no, that's not going to work for me. In this way, you guarantee everyone to do it. I don't know what you mean by that. I don't know what you mean by that. Chan says, can you explain one more time the final paper? Well, okay. I'll explain it again tomorrow, because maybe tomorrow I can talk about the format outline thing that KC that you asked for. So yeah, I'll explain it again tomorrow, Chan, if that's okay. 3 sources is not necessarily a lot, because what I want you to keep in mind about sources is that you don't have to take everything from them, okay? Like, you don't have to, if you have a paper that's 4 pages long, okay? So let's say you find an article online and it's 4 pages. You don't have to tell me everything that is in that 4 pages. That's not what this is about, and that's not what real academic paper writing is about either. In many cases, you might just reference something very quickly, right? So the section that we read today, the little blurb that we read today, it was about 2 pages long, let's say, maybe 1 and a bit. It's about maybe it's 2 pages long, but if all you wanted to talk about was that sort of divide between East and West, you could do it, right? So you could just say, in your paper, often the West likes to create an opposition of the East and see it as a more sexist or more oppressive place for women. And then you give a little citation, and then that would be it. And then you could talk about your own ideas after that. So there was other stuff in that thing that we read today, right? There was the thing about corporate culture. There was the thing about the items in the news. There was all of those things, but you don't have to talk about everything, right? So if you read that, what makes sexism difficult to see, and for your paper, the only part of that article that is useful is the part about the sort of East versus West idea, you can just mention that idea and just ignore the rest of it. So just because you have a paper that is 5 pages, not a paper, if you have an article, let's say, that is 5 pages or 10 or even 20, it doesn't mean you have to take all of that information and put it into your paper. You only have to take what you need, okay? So in some ways, research papers are kind of like a collage in some ways, or they're kind of like a mosaic, and you only kind of don't steal, you only kind of borrow and then cite the pieces that you need in order to assemble your answer, right? So you don't have to tell me everything that's in that article or any article. You just have to find the pieces of information that you need to answer your question and make your case, okay? So again, 3 sources is a lot if you were to totally summarize and put them all in one paper, but again, that's not what I'm asking for. All you have to do is take from these other sources the stuff that you need, right? And the rest of it you can ignore. Is it required to have 3? I'd like you to have a few other sources. I'd like you to have 3 other sources. Again, Casey, you don't have to fully summarize them. You can just borrow the pieces you need and cite them properly, and again, ignore the rest. So if you found a really long article, but there was a section that talked about the thing that you really wanted to talk about, then just use that section and ignore the rest of it, okay? That's kind of how these things work. You don't have to, if you use an article, even if it's 20 pages long, you don't have to talk about every single thing in that 20-page article. You just borrow the bit that you need to talk about what you want to talk about, okay? I can give you an example of that as well tomorrow if it helps you out. Okay, so we can come back to that tomorrow. We've only got about 5 minutes left. We can come back to that tomorrow. Maybe what I'll do is I will explain the format or the sort of structure of the paper a little more. I'll give you an example of a way it could work, and that might help you. And maybe I'll try to give an example of that citation thing, okay? Yeah, I'll do those 2 things tomorrow. In the meantime, I know, Karen, I kind of put you on the spot and said, what do you need? And you said, I don't know, and that's fair. But others, if you don't know and you think of something today or tomorrow that you might want me to talk about, then just let me know and I'll talk about it. Yeah, okay, so until then, I'll leave you with that. I'm gonna try and mark your second micropaper a little bit later today. It's gonna be really hot in here, but I'm gonna try and do it. And then I'll try to get those back to you really quick. In the meantime, you can look at this final assignment. Again, it's on Student Portal and on Microsoft Teams, and start to think a little bit about what you might want, which question you might want to answer, and how you might want to answer it. And I'll give you a little more sort of detail or explanation or help tomorrow and and in the days to come as well, okay? So I'm going to leave it there because we've got 3 minutes left. Thank you all for being here. Thank you those of you who participated here in the live chat. That article was short, but it was kind of thick. It was kind of dense, and so I think we did an okay job with it. Come back tomorrow. We'll talk more about the final paper, and we'll finish sexism, and maybe we'll get on to ableism as well. I'll see some of you in about 10 minutes. I'll see some of you tomorrow. Have a nice day. Stay healthy. Wear a mask. Yeah, and I'll see you tomorrow.